The moment the 250-pound inmate locked eyes with Mike Tyson in the prison shower, everyone in the room felt it. The shift in air, the quiet tension, the unspoken promise of violence. And what happened next would become one of the most whispered stories in that facility. A story about pride, patience, and the kind of power that only reveals itself when someone makes the mistake of pushing too far. Long before fists flew or bodies hit concrete, it started like most prison confrontations do. Subtle, quiet, almost invisible to anyone who didn't understand the language of survival behind bars. It was late afternoon in 1993, months into Mike Tyson's sentence at an Indiana correctional facility, and the prison was settling into its usual rhythm, that strange balance between boredom and danger, where nothing happens for hours, and then everything happens in seconds. Mike had learned how to move through that world without drawing unnecessary attention. Head down, routine steady, emotions controlled, because in prison, reputation could protect you, but it could also make you a target. The shower block was one of the few places where privacy didn't exist and respect was constantly tested. A long concrete room filled with steam, echoing voices, dripping pipes, and men who had learned to read threats in posture rather than words. Mike had just finished his workout in the yard and walked into the showers with the same quiet focus he carried everywhere, nodding slightly to a few inmates he recognized, ignoring others who watched him with curiosity, envy, or suspicion. Most men gave him space. They had heard the stories, seen the way he carried himself, sensed that he wasn't someone who needed to prove anything. But not everyone believed the legend. Across the room, leaning casually against the tiled wall as if he owned the space, stood Marcus Hale, a man who had arrived at the facility only weeks earlier and had already built a reputation for being big, aggressive, and eager to establish dominance. Marcus wasn't loud like some inmates who barked threats for attention. He was quiet, observant, the kind of man who studied people before deciding whether to challenge them. And when he noticed Mike Tyson step under the water a few rows away, something in his expression changed. He watched Mike the way hunters watch prey, not with fear, not with respect, but with calculation. Other inmates noticed Marcus watching and slowly shifted their positions, pretending to mind their own business while keeping him in their peripheral vision. Because in prison, when a man like Marcus focused on someone like Mike, it usually meant something was about to happen. Mike felt the stare before he saw it, that instinct sharpened by years of fighting and surviving. And when he turned his head slightly, their eyes met for the first time. Marcus didn't look away. He didn't blink. He didn't smile. He just stared, long enough for the message to land. Mike held the gaze for a moment, then turned back to the water, refusing to play the game. That should have ended it. In prison, walking away can be a form of dominance. But Marcus interpreted it differently. He pushed himself off the wall and started walking toward Mike, slow and deliberate. Each step heavy, confident, measured, his presence impossible to ignore. Conversations around the room began to fade, voices lowering, laughter cutting off mid-sentence, because everyone understood that they were about to witness something they might later regret seeing. Marcus stopped a few feet from Mike, close enough that the steam rising from the showers blurred the space between them, close enough that Mike could feel the heat of his body and the weight of his stare. "So that's him," Marcus said quietly, not shouting, not performing, just speaking with calm certainty, his voice carrying through the echoing room. Mike didn't answer. He rinsed his hands slowly, methodically, refusing to give Marcus the reaction he wanted. Marcus tilted his head slightly, studying him like a puzzle. "Funny," he continued, glancing briefly around at the men pretending not to listen. "I thought you'd be taller." A few inmates shifted uncomfortably. Mike turned his head slightly, but still didn't fully face him. "You need something?" he asked calmly, his voice low, controlled, almost bored. Marcus smirked faintly. "Just trying to figure out if the stories are real," he said. Mike shut off the water and reached for his towel, moving with deliberate calm, signaling that the conversation was over. Marcus stepped closer. "You walk away a lot," he said. Mike paused, then shrugged slightly. "Keeps life simple." Marcus shook his head slowly, his eyes narrowing just a fraction. "No," he said, his voice dropping even lower. "It usually means someone's scared." The word landed like a slap, and the room went completely silent. Mike turned fully this time, meeting Marcus's eyes directly, And for a moment the two men stood there in silence, surrounded by steam, concrete, and the attention of dozens of inmates who understood that this wasn't just about insults. It was about hierarchy, respect, and who controlled the space. "I'm not scared of you," Mike said quietly. "I just don't see the point." Marcus smiled, but it wasn't friendly. "You will," he said, and before anyone could react, he reached out casually and flicked Mike's towel off his shoulder, letting it drop to the wet floor. It was a small gesture, almost harmless on the surface, but everyone in that room knew what it meant. In prison, that wasn't a joke. That was a declaration. Mike looked down at the towel for a moment, then slowly bent down and picked it up, placing it back on his shoulder with the same calm precision he used in everything else. For a second, it looked like he was going to walk away again, and some inmates actually relaxed, thinking the situation had ended. Marcus thought the same thing. He stepped back half an inch, his confidence growing, his belief that the legend of Mike Tyson had been exaggerated by fear and rumor. Mike turned slightly, as if to leave. Then Marcus moved again, faster this time, reaching out and shoving Mike's shoulder with a sudden burst of force. "Don't ignore me," he said. And in that instant, before anyone could breathe, before anyone could shout, before anyone could step in, the entire atmosphere of the room changed, because everyone sensed that whatever came next was going to be something they would never forget. By the time Marcus's hand left Mike Tyson's shoulder, the entire shower block understood that something irreversible had just happened, the kind of moment that couldn't be walked back, laughed off, or ignored, because in prison, once a line is crossed, it doesn't disappear, it demands an answer. For a brief second, nothing moved. Water kept pounding against concrete. Steam kept rising. But the men inside that room stopped breathing like normal people and started breathing like witnesses. Marcus stood tall, chest lifted, his expression calm but charged with expectation, as if he had just thrown a match into dry grass and was waiting to see how fast it would burn. Mike stood still, towel over his shoulder, eyes lowered slightly, not in fear but in thought, and anyone who had ever watched him fight on the outside would have recognized the difference between a man who was angry and a man who was calculating. Marcus mistook the silence for weakness. He rolled his shoulders slowly, letting the muscles under his skin shift like machinery, and spoke again, louder this time, so that everyone could hear. "That's it," he said with a faint laugh. "That's Mike Tyson?" A few inmates shifted their weight nervously, because they knew that words like that were dangerous, not because they insulted Mike, but because they challenged the balance that kept violence from exploding every day in that place. Mike lifted his head slowly and looked at Marcus, his eyes steady, his expression unreadable. "You should stop," he said quietly. Marcus shook his head. "Stop what?" he asked. "Talking." He stepped closer, closing the distance again, invading Mike's space deliberately, his voice dropping into something almost conversational. "You know what people say about you in here?" he continued. Mike didn't respond. Marcus leaned slightly forward. "They say you're smart," he said. "They say you avoid fights. They say you're trying to be different from the old Tyson. But I see something else." He tapped his own chest lightly with one finger. "I see someone who knows that if he fights the wrong person in here, he might not walk away." The words rippled through the room like electricity. A few inmates glanced toward the exits, calculating how fast they could move if things exploded. Mike took a slow breath, the kind of breath fighters take before making decisions they can't undo. And for a moment, it looked like he might simply turn and walk out of the showers, choosing discipline over pride, survival over ego. He took one step sideways, as if to leave. Marcus laughed softly. "Yeah," he said. "That's what I thought." And then, with a sudden burst of movement, he stepped forward again and bumped Mike's chest with his own, not violently, not explosively, but deliberately, sending a clear message that he wasn't finished. That was when something changed in Mike's posture. Not dramatically, not explosively, but subtly, the way storms shift before they break. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't clench his fists. He simply straightened slightly, his shoulders relaxing instead of tensing, his breathing slowing instead of speeding up. "You don't know me," Mike said calmly. Marcus smiled wider. "I'm getting to know you," he replied. Around them, the men in the showers had formed an invisible circle, not physically stepping closer but emotionally leaning in, because moments like this were rare, moments when prison hierarchy was tested in real time. Marcus glanced briefly at the crowd, feeding off their attention, and then looked back at Mike. "Let me explain something to you," he said. "Up there, you were somebody. In here, you're just another man. And every man in here gets tested eventually." Mike nodded slightly, as if acknowledging a fact rather than an insult. "You made your point," he said. Marcus shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "I haven't." He reached out again, not fast, not violent, but deliberate, and grabbed the edge of Mike's towel, tugging it lightly, just enough to remind him who had initiated this confrontation. The gesture was subtle, almost playful, but everyone understood its meaning. Mike looked down at the towel, then back at Marcus. The room was silent enough that the drip of water from the pipes sounded like ticking clocks. "Last chance," Mike said quietly. Marcus tilted his head. "For what?" he asked. Mike met his eyes. "To walk away," he said. For a brief moment, Marcus hesitated, not because he was afraid, but because he felt something he hadn't expected: doubt. He had imagined Mike as explosive, arrogant, emotional. Instead, he was facing someone calm, controlled, almost detached, and that unsettled him more than anger would have. But pride is louder than instinct, and in prison, pride can be fatal. Marcus let out a short laugh and shook his head. "You're not walking away from me," he said, his voice hardening. "Not today." He shoved Mike's shoulder again, harder than before, no longer pretending it was accidental. The impact echoed slightly in the tiled room. A few inmates flinched. Mike didn't move. He absorbed the shove without stepping back, without raising his hands, without reacting in any obvious way. And for the first time, Marcus's confidence wavered. He stared at Mike more closely now, as if trying to read something in his face that wasn't there. "What?" Marcus asked. "You going to do something now?" Mike didn't answer immediately. He simply stood there, looking at Marcus with a level of focus that made the air feel heavier. Around them, men who had survived decades in prison felt a strange instinctive urge to step backward, even though nothing had happened yet. Then Mike slowly reached down, adjusted the towel on his shoulder, and looked back up. "You already decided this," he said quietly. Marcus frowned slightly. "Decided what?" he asked. Mike's voice was calm, almost reflective. "You decided you wanted a fight," he said. "I tried to give you another option." Marcus stared at him for a moment, then shrugged, as if the choice didn't matter anymore. "Then let's stop talking," he said. The words had barely left his mouth when he stepped forward again, his body leaning into Mike's space with open challenge, his hands lifting slightly, not into a guard, not into a punch, but into the posture of a man who believed his size alone was enough to win. And in that exact moment, before fists flew, before guards reacted, before anyone could intervene, the entire prison seemed to hold its breath, because everyone understood that whatever happened next would not just decide a fight. It would decide who controlled fear in that place from that day forward. The moment Marcus leaned forward with that confident, careless step, he sealed his own fate, though he didn't know it yet, because in prison, the most dangerous thing you can do is mistake calm for weakness and silence for fear, and what happened in the next few seconds would rewrite the unspoken rules of that shower block forever. Mike Tyson didn't explode the way everyone expected him to, didn't roar, didn't swing wildly, didn't move like a street fighter or an angry man. Instead, he moved like a professional, like someone who had spent his entire life mastering violence so completely that he no longer needed to rush it. Before Marcus could lift his hands fully, Mike took one short step forward, closing the distance so quickly that Marcus barely registered it. And in that fraction of a second, something in Marcus's eyes changed from confidence to confusion, because he suddenly realized that size meant nothing when distance disappeared. The first punch came low, compact, precise, a brutal shot to the body that drove all the air out of Marcus's lungs in a violent gasp, his chest collapsing inward, as if the impact had unplugged him from oxygen itself. And before his brain could even process the pain, the second punch landed, a sharp, perfectly timed hook that snapped his head sideways with a dull crack that echoed off the tiled walls and cut through the hiss of running water like a gunshot. The entire exchange lasted less than 2 seconds, but it felt longer to everyone watching, because they were witnessing something rare in prison life. Not chaos, not a messy brawl, but pure, surgical dominance. Marcus staggered backward, his massive frame suddenly weightless, his eyes wide and unfocused, his legs failing him as if they had forgotten their purpose. And then gravity took over, slamming his 250-pound body onto the wet concrete floor with a heavy, final thud that made several inmates instinctively flinch. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. Even the water seemed quieter. Mike stood where he was, shoulders relaxed, breathing steady, fists unclenched, not celebrating, not glaring, not posturing, just looking down at Marcus with the calm detachment of a man who had already tried every other option. A few seconds passed, and then one inmate near the back slowly turned off his shower, as if sudden noise might somehow restart the world, while another stepped back unconsciously, creating space around Mike without being told to. Marcus's chest rose unevenly as he struggled to breathe, his mouth opening and closing like someone waking from a nightmare, his hands twitching as if his body hadn't yet accepted that the fight was already over. Mike bent down calmly, picked up his towel where it had fallen earlier, placed it over his shoulder again, and walked past Marcus without looking back, his footsteps slow and unhurried, as if he had just finished a normal conversation instead of dismantling a challenge in front of half the prison. That was when the room finally reacted. A low murmur spread through the showers, not loud enough to attract guards, but heavy enough to carry meaning, a mixture of shock, respect, and fear, because everyone understood that what they had just witnessed wasn't just a fight. It was a demonstration. Within seconds, someone shouted down the hallway for help, and guards began rushing toward the shower block, whistles blowing, boots pounding against concrete, radios crackling with urgency. But by the time they arrived, the moment had already passed. They found Marcus sitting on the floor, dazed and disoriented, his back against the tile wall, water dripping down his face, his pride shattered more thoroughly than his jaw, while Mike stood several feet away, calm, silent, towel over his shoulder, surrounded by inmates who suddenly seemed very interested in the ceiling, the walls, the floor, anything except the scene in front of them. "What happened here?" one guard demanded, scanning the room, baton ready, eyes sharp with suspicion. For a few seconds, no one answered. Then someone, near the lockers, cleared his throat. "He slipped," the inmate said casually. The guard frowned. "Slipped?" he repeated. Another inmate nodded. "Yeah," he said. "Wet floor." A third man added. "He was talking trash, stepped wrong, went down hard." The guards exchanged glances. They knew better. They could see the truth written in Marcus's posture, in the tension of the room, in the way no one was willing to look directly at Mike. But without witnesses willing to talk, without cameras covering this corner of the shower block, there was nothing they could prove. Marcus was escorted out to the infirmary, still shaken, still trying to understand how a man smaller than him had erased his confidence in seconds, while Mike was told to return to his cell, his expression unchanged, his demeanor almost indifferent. As he walked down the hallway, inmates stepped aside instinctively, not out of friendship, not out of admiration, but out of a new understanding that had settled into the prison like fog. Mike Tyson was not someone you tested for entertainment. Later that night, the story began to spread, as all prison stories do, traveling from cell to cell, growing with every retelling. Some saying Marcus had attacked first, others saying Mike barely touched him, others exaggerating the moment into a full-scale battle. But beneath the exaggerations, the core truth remained intact. A man had challenged Mike Tyson in the showers, and Mike had ended the challenge in less time than it took most people to blink. Marcus returned to general population days later with bruises on his face and something far deeper in his eyes, a quiet humility that hadn't been there before, and from that day forward, he avoided Mike completely, never speaking his name, never meeting his gaze, never stepping into his space again. The prison adjusted its invisible hierarchy accordingly. Men who had once whispered doubts about Mike's reputation stopped whispering. Men who had once imagined themselves testing him changed their minds. And Mike, true to his nature, didn't boast, didn't threaten, didn't seek recognition for what he had done. He went back to his routine, back to his silence, back to his discipline, knowing that in prison, the most powerful statements are not made with words but with moments that cannot be undone. Long after the steam cleared from the shower block and the guards forgot the details of that afternoon, the inmates remembered it differently. Not as a fight, but as a lesson, because they had learned something that day about strength, about restraint, and about the cost of confusing patience with weakness. And in the quiet language of prison survival, the message was simple and permanent. Some men walk away because they are afraid, and some men walk away because they are dangerous enough that they don't need to prove it until someone forces them to.